they all share some characteristics, but Balrogs are individuals, they are sort of people, and so I'm not sure we should assume they all look identical. And thirdly, throughout Tolkien's lifetime, his conception of Balrogs changed significantly. In his earliest writings, there are loads of them. They are not that hard to kill, and they function more like elite first-age Uruk-hai than the catastrophic Flame of Udun that we meet in The Lord of the Rings. This is worth keeping in mind whenever we're talking about Balrogs. There are basically two distinct creatures with that same name, and one of them evolved from the other slowly in Tolkien's imagination. Anyway, to kick things off, I suppose we should start with the beginning of time and the creation of the universe. That's where the Balrogs began, as offspring of Ilúvatar's thought, brought into being in the timeless halls before anything else was made. They are Ainur, divine, angelic, holy beings who join together and sing the universe into creation. But unlike most of the Ainur, the future Balrogs were among those who rebelled. They fell in league with the mightiest Ainu, Melkor, the original Dark Lord, and they watched him weave darkness and discord into the music of creation. Afterwards, once the universe was made and the planet of Arda was formed, many of the Ainur left the Timeless Halls and descended into creation, where they became known as the Valar and the Maiar. What followed was the First War, in which Melkor battled his former brethren for rulership over the world. Tolkien tells us, "Many were drawn to his splendor in the days of his greatness, and remained in that allegiance down into his darkness. Dreadful among these spirits were the Valaraukar, the scourges of fire that in Middle-earth were called the Balrogs, demons of terror." This is the earliest point in the story, I think, where we can talk about what Balrogs might have looked like. Before their spirits descended into Arda, they wouldn't have needed bodies, but in Middle-earth they do have physical forms. They have an appearance. And from the very beginning, we are told that fire is a key part of it. During the First Age, the Balrogs came to their master's aid as a tempest of fire, and they wielded many thonged whips of flame as well as red swords like stabbing tongues of fire. And then, an enormous amount of time later in the story, during The Lord of the Rings, we will meet Durin's Bane, probably the last Balrog, who also seems to have fire right at the heart of his characterization. The orcs of Moria refer to him using their orcish word for flame, gosh. And fire clearly seems to respond to his presence. He demonstrates an ability to wrap it about him almost like a cloak. We are also told that when the Balrog tried leaping across a fissure, the flames roared up to greet it, and wreathed about it, and a black smoke swirled in the air. Its streaming mane kindled and blazed behind it. So I think it's safe to say all Balrogs share this association. There's more to them, but a major part of their power does seem to come from the fire that burns all around them and within them. You might be thinking though, well, can't all the Maiar choose their forms and change into new bodies at will? You know, like changing their raiment? Wouldn't this mean Balrogs can shapeshift into basically anything they want? Well, that is a good point. We're never told exactly how the Balrogs came to inhabit their fiery scourge-like forms in the first place, but I would suggest they did choose to look that way. You know, terrifying is kind of what they're going for. Fire consumes and destroys. It is an excellent thing for elite killing machines to have streaming across their bodies. However, what we are told more explicitly is that when a Maiar performs evil deeds, they become wedded to the forms of their evil deeds, and if these bodies were taken from them or destroyed, they were nullified. So, I guess this means, although the Balrogs were free to choose fiery forms when they first entered Arda, over time, and as a consequence of joining Melkor and rebelling against Ilúvatar, they got stuck in their fiery bodies and thus became vulnerable. Which got me thinking, right? Surely that means, by the time the Fellowship of the Ring are scurrying across the bridge of Khazad-dûm, the Balrog, Durin's Bane, probably has, like, the oldest arms, legs, head, and torso of any being in Middle-earth. He has been bound in that one body longer than anyone else that we know of, literally for tens of thousands of years. I'll admit, maybe Tom Bombadil might be the exception, but old Tom is like the living definition of enigmatic. Who knows what's going on with his body? Also, you might be wondering, well, what about Sauron? Because he totally is an evil Maya, but clearly he can still change his form. However, I would argue Sauron's shapeshifting is less an example of casting off his body like raiment in the way that other Maya do, and it's more to do with him utilizing his dark magical gifts as the deceiver. You know, Balrogs wield flame to fight their foes, Sauron wields a fair disguise. Also important to note, in the Second Age, after pissing off Iluvatar one time too many, he totally does lose his ability to take a fair form or to appear as anything other than a spirit of malice made visible. Anyway, one more thing to mention about Balrog shapeshifting before moving on. There is a moment in The Lord of the Rings where Gandalf tells us about his conflict with Durin's Bane after they had both fallen to the bottom of the abyss beneath the bridge of Khazad-dûm. There, the Balrog's fire was extinguished by the cold black water, and it became instead a strong and strangling thing of slime. Gandalf fought it beneath the living earth and then pursued it up the endless stair to the peak of Ziraxigil, where it burst again into new flame. Thus, we can say with confidence that quenching a Balrog's fire certainly does not kill it, and their flames can be reignited after injury. But whilst their fire is doused, their appearance is significantly changed, and they are put in a weakened state. Anyway, apart from fire, what else can we definitely associate with a Balrog's physical appearance? Well, I don't think I'm going to blow anyone's minds with this. In addition to flame, there is also shadow. In the later Silmarillion, we are told their hearts were afire, but they were cloaked in darkness, and a terror went before them. Which syncs up very nicely with how Durin's Bane is described in The Lord of the Rings. In that story, we're told he was like a great shadow, in the middle of which was a dark form, of man-shape maybe, yet greater. And a power and terror seemed to be in it, and to go before it. This line fascinates me, because it's the only one we ever get that tells us what general shape a Balrog has. And contrary to the way they are presented in like a lot of artwork, that shape is vaguely of a man, yet greater. A lot of the most iconic portrayals of Balrogs show them as monsters with animal-like traits. They are often drawn with horns and fangs and a tail, but there isn't actually any specific text from Tolkien to support that. I'm certainly not saying they shouldn't be imagined with horns and a tail. Balrogs are described as demons, so horns do make sense. Also, they look cool. But because the horned and beastly Balrog is portrayed so often, for the purposes of making this video a little bit more interesting, I want to suggest something slightly different from what we're all already so familiar with. What if we embraced Tolkien's description of Durin's Bane as of man shape maybe, yet greater? What if we think of the Balrog as less of an it and more of a him? Balrogs are not the only Maya spirits of fire to be mentioned in Tolkien's writings. In the Silmarillion, we meet a Maya lady called Arien, and back in the beginning, Melkor tried to corrupt her and recruit her just like he did to the Balrogs. Perhaps he intended for Arien to be his token lady, Balrog, but she resisted. She stayed true to Iluvatar. She ended up burning the Dark Lord, and towards the end of the First Age, she was chosen to guide the sun across the sky and to scorch the forces of evil with the heat of her eyes, which is why daylight becomes so painful to orcs and trolls. Arien does not like them. It's true, she is not quite as iconic of a character as, like Durin's Bane or Gothmog, the Lord of all Balrogs, but many artists have illustrated many versions of her, and yet all the ones I've seen present her as looking like a humanoid woman. She's often wreathed in flame, which makes a lot of sense, but I've yet to see any artwork of Arianne with specifically animal features like horns or wings or a tail. I would imagine, and this is just my speculation, I'm not suggesting there's like a correct way to picture any of these characters, but in my mind's eye, I think Durin's Bane and the other Balrogs might look much more like an evil male version of Arianne than a great big hulking beast. Similarly, in the Silmarillion, there's a different Maiar, this time a lord of storms and coastal waters called Ossë. And although Tolkien tells us basically nothing about what he looks like, he is pretty much always presented by artists as a sea-dwelling humanoid. If someone were to draw him as, I don't know, like a tentacled kraken-esque monster, I certainly wouldn't say that's the wrong way to imagine this fantasy being, but it would be a very unconventional take on the character. Isn't it interesting that in the vast majority of Tolkien art featuring a Maiar created by a wide variety of artists, the subject is almost always presented as being of man shape maybe, yet greater, except in the majority of Balrog art, where they are often illustrated to look nothing like a man, despite that quotation being applied to the Balrog in The Lord of the Rings. I think the reason for this is mainly because John Howe, Alan Lee, Ted Naismith, and multiple film and video game adaptations have done such a good job at presenting the quintessential monstrous Balrog. But my point with this video is simply to demonstrate, although that is a very, very, very epic way of looking at them, there is another way to imagine these evil beings. And if we do buy into the slightly less conventional but more recognizably man-shaped conception of a Balrog, it leads to an interesting question that might be neglected if we only ever think of them as beast-like creatures. Can Balrogs speak? On the one hand, the answer is we don't know. But on the other hand, I think, almost certainly, yes. Language is the foundation upon which all of Tolkien's writings stand, and the capacity for speech is, I think, accepted as a given among all of the other Maiar. Also, you don't even have to be man-shaped in Middle-earth to be able to speak. We see examples of eagles, and dragons, and a dog that can all talk, and I don't think those characters are Maiar. I think they are ennobled animals, so it certainly would seem strange if Balrogs didn't share that linguistic ability. Also, during the battles of the First Age, we know that Gothmog, the lord of the Balrogs, took counsel and gave orders, so it certainly does seem like he at least had language. What language the Balrogs spoke, however, is a much trickier question. By the time of The Lord of the Rings, the common tongue of Middle-earth was Westron, but I think it's highly unlikely Durin's Bane would have been familiar with that. Back in the First Age, Westron did not even exist, and the languages of the good guys were Elvish in nature. I think it's even more highly unlikely that any Balrog would choose to speak Sindarin or Quenya, so if I had to guess, I would say the Balrogs used either some dialect of Orcish or another lost language of Angband, perhaps even the Melchian tongue that the Dark Lord invented. I should also point out, there are multiple Maiar in the story who demonstrate an ability to communicate telepathically, so perhaps the Balrogs used this gift too. Either way, there's every reason to believe Balrogs did possess cunning minds and had complex thoughts, just as all the other Maiar did, and I see no reason why they couldn't convey these thoughts just as articulately as anyone else. In The Lord of the Rings, there's one particular moment in Moria that I don't think's ever been included in any adaptation, but it always grabs my imagination and makes me picture the Balrog very differently from how he is often presented. In the book, after the Fellowship fights the orcs in the Chamber of Mazabul, 8 of them run away from Balin's tomb while Gandalf stays behind to put a shutting spell on the door. We don't see what happens next, but a short while later, Gandalf comes hurtling down the stairs, clearly terrified. He tells the Fellowship, "I have met my match and have nearly been destroyed." Then he tells Gimli, "I found myself suddenly faced by something that I have not met before. Something came into the chamber. I felt it through the door, and the orcs themselves were afraid and fell silent. It laid hold of the iron ring, and then it perceived me and my spell. What it was, I cannot guess, but I have never felt such a challenge. The counterspell was terrible. It nearly broke me. What this moment evokes, in my imagination, isn't some kind of demonic monster, but a demonic sorcerer of shadow and flame. I think there's something fascinating about Gandalf and the Balrog both standing effectively face to face with a door between them, both with one hand on the handle, both uttering spells and words of command and counterspells, and both struggling to outdo the other in a magical duel. I think Balrogs are often imagined as like mighty shock troopers who do lots of damage with their fiery swords and battlefield prowess, but in this scene, Durin's Bane demonstrates a decidedly different flavour of danger. He goes toe-to-toe with a wizard and almost beats him in a contest of magical might. And this moment also makes me wonder if Durin's Bane can fit into the dwarf-built chamber of Mazabul and lay a hand upon the door handle. How tall is he? Like, how big is a Balrog? When it comes to looking cool, bigger is often better, I guess. Balrogs certainly are not small, but they're also probably not the colossal titans they are sometimes presented as. And we actually have a decent amount of admittedly imperfect evidence to suggest they are nowhere near as big as sometimes imagined. In Tolkien's original draft of The Lord of the Rings, he wrote that Durin's Bane was no more than man-high. In subsequent revisions, he wrote a note to himself saying, "Alter description of Balrog, it seemed to be of man's shape, but its form could not be plainly discerned. It felt larger than it looked." And then in the actual published Lord of the Rings, we are told it was of man's shape, maybe, yet greater. So it seems Tolkien did increase the Balrog size a little while redrafting, but none of this implies a giant. There is also a line in the Book of Lost Tales where we are told about fan-favourite character Glorfindel fighting a Balrog, and there it's written, "His dagger pierced the Balrog's belly nigh his own face, for that demon was double his stature." On the one hand, this may seem fairly conclusive. Balrogs are roughly twice the height of an elf. But this isn't as straightforward as it might seem. The Book of Lost Tales is made up of material that was written a long time before The Lord of the Rings. Not only were Balrogs very different back then, so too were elves. What I just read was penned in 1917, while Tolkien was recovering from trench fever during the First World War. And back then, in his conception of Middle-earth, elves were considerably smaller and more diminutive than they afterwards became. So I don't think this can be taken as proof that Balrogs were double the size of, like, a Lord of the Rings style elf. Although, of course, you may very well be thinking, both shadows and flame are quite well known in the real world for changing size depending on their circumstances. So surely it stands to reason, if your body's made out of shadow and flame, you can probably choose to let your fire burn down and draw your shadows about you, thereby shrinking, or you could blaze into a great inferno and cast your shadows from wall to wall. And even if Balrogs aren't growing to an enormous size physically, we know they come with an aura of terror which when unleashed makes them feel much larger than they actually are. Anyway, the last question I want to tackle with this video, how many Balrogs were there? This is one of those questions where we get wildly different answers depending on which of Tolkien's writings we look at. In most of his earliest versions, there were loads of Balrogs, and heroes used to kill them left, right, and centre. Sometimes they numbered in the hundreds, other times in the thousands. Which might leave some Lord of the Rings fans scratching their heads. You know, if Durin's Bane was once one of thousands, and one time some guy with an axe killed like 5 of his peers in the same battle, doesn't that make his showdown with Gandalf on the bridge of Khazad-dûm a little bit less special? Well, it's a fair point, and Christopher Tolkien addressed it by acknowledging the early conception of Balrogs makes them less terrible and certainly more destructible than they afterwards became. But it's actually a bit of a misconception that Tolkien changed his mind on this very early in his creative process. In the Grey Annals, which were penned a few years after The Lord of the Rings was published, he wrote, "There came wolves and wolf riders, and there came Balrogs, 1,000. And in the Annals of Aman, written around the same time, we are told about a sudden host of Balrogs coming forth from Melkor's fortress. However, the reason we very seldom ever think of Balrogs numbering in the hundreds or thousands, apart from the fact that it does kind of undermine Gandalf's big moment, is because in the margin of that text from the Annals of Aman, Tolkien wrote the note, "There should not be supposed more than, say, 3, or at most 7, ever existed." So, there you go. It is only one sentence scrawled in a margin, and the note itself is not dated, but it does explicitly tell us, at one point, late in his process, Tolkien rejected his earlier idea for legions of Balrogs and limited them to, I guess, a minimum of 2, or at the maximum, 7. One of them is obviously Gothmog, the chief of the Balrogs, another is obviously Durin's Bane, and in a very early version of the Children of Húrin story, there is mention of a Balrog lord called Lungorthine. This guy is never mentioned anywhere again,